The kitchen felt smaller than usual, the air thick with unspoken tension. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the clock above the stove, each second stretching into an eternity as I listened to my mother's voice on the other end of the line. She had called to ask, no, to demand, that I come home to help with the twins. Her tone was laced with the expectation that I would comply, just as I always had in the past. Rosie, you know how much I need you right now. The twins are a handful, and your stepfather is working late every night. I can't do this alone, she pleaded, her voice wavering slightly, as if she was teetering on the edge of desperation. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my fingers harder against the cold counter. The old nickname she used, Rosie, felt like a noose tightening around my neck. I was no longer the little girl she could guilt into doing whatever she wanted. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the words came out sharper than I intended. Mom, I'm not coming back, I said firmly, each syllable a small rebellion. You'll have to figure it out on your own. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a heavy silence that spoke of her shock. She wasn't used to hearing me speak like this. I had always been the one to relent, to make peace, to smooth over the cracks in our relationship. But not anymore. What do you mean you're not coming back? She finally asked, her voice rising in pitch, the familiar edge of exasperation creeping in. You're my daughter, and your family needs you. You can't just abandon us. The word abandon stung, but I pushed past it, knowing this was a conversation that needed to happen. I had spent years bending to her will, putting my own needs aside, but I couldn't do it any longer. I wouldn't. Mom, you've always expected me to pick up the pieces, to be there when things fall apart. But it's not my responsibility to fix everything for you, I said, my voice trembling slightly but gaining strength with each word. You've made your choices, and now it's time for you to live with them. Her breath caught in her throat, and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head as she tried to find the right words to pull me back in. But I wasn't the same person anymore, and she couldn't manipulate me with guilt or obligation. Rosalie, she began, using my full name in that way she did when she was trying to assert authority. You don't understand what it's like. I've sacrificed so much for you. And I'm grateful for what you've done, I interrupted, my voice softening just a fraction. But you also need to understand that I've been carrying a lot of pain because of your decisions. I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not. She went silent again, and I could feel the weight of all the years between us, the unresolved hurts, the things we never talked about. But this time, I wouldn't let her brush it under the rug. Rosie, please, I'm trying to make things right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, a crack in the facade she always put up. I know I haven't been the best mother, but I need you. I swallowed hard, feeling the lump in my throat. A part of me wanted to give in, to ease her burden, but I knew that doing so would only trap me in the same cycle we'd been in for years. I had to stand my ground for my own sake. I'm sorry, Mom, but I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice steady. You have to learn to live without me. I need to live my own life. Her silence was like a cold wind, sweeping through the phone line and chilling me to the bone. I waited for her to say something, anything, but the seconds ticked by in agonizing stillness. Finally, I heard a soft sigh, more resigned than angry. Okay, she whispered, the fight gone from her voice, if that's what you really want. It's not what I want, I replied, the words catching in my throat, but it's what I need. There was nothing left to say after that. I hung up the phone, the click echoing in the stillness of the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of relief and sorrow swirling within me. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, but the path ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty. I leaned against the counter, staring at the phone as if it held the answers to all the questions that now filled my mind. Had I done the right thing? Would she ever understand why I had to distance myself? The doubts lingered, but deep down, I knew this was the only way forward. I couldn't keep sacrificing my happiness for the sake of a past that couldn't be changed. And so, with a deep breath, I turned away from the phone, ready to embrace whatever came next. It was time to live for myself. The day after my conversation with my mother, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in the pit of my stomach. I wandered through my apartment, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks. Washing dishes, folding laundry, watering the plants. But no matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back to the past, to the memories I had spent years trying to bury. It all started with the sound of that door closing behind my father. I was only 5 years old, but the memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. I remember standing in the hallway, clutching my stuffed bear, watching him walk away without so much as a backward glance. The echo of his footsteps faded, leaving behind a silence that would come to define so much of my childhood. "Where's Daddy going?" I'd ask my mother, my small voice trembling with confusion. She had knelt down to my level, her face a mask of forced calm. "He's going on a trip, sweetheart. He'll be back soon." But he didn't come back. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and still, I stood by the window every evening, waiting for him to return. My mother stopped mentioning him after a while, as if by erasing his presence from our conversations, she could erase him from our lives. But I knew better. Even at that young age, I could sense the lie in her words, the way she avoided looking me in the eye when I asked about him. One night, after yet another failed attempt to get an answer from her, I remember retreating to my room, where I found solace in my stuffed animals. I arranged them in a circle around me, as if they could protect me from the gnawing fear that I had been abandoned for good. But even their soft fur couldn't shield me from the loneliness that seeped into every corner of my heart. As time went on, other men came into our lives, filling the space my father had left behind, but none of them felt right. They were strangers who tried too hard to play the role of a father, yet they always fell short. I remember the awkward dinners, the forced conversations, and the way I would retreat to my room as soon as I could, closing the door on the life my mother was trying to build. One of them, though, left a deeper scar than the others. His name was Carl, and from the moment he entered our lives, I knew there was something off about him. He was too friendly, too eager to get close, and his eyes lingered on me in a way that made my skin crawl. But I was just a child, and I didn't have the words to explain what I felt. "Carl, could you help Rosalie with her homework?" My mother would often say, her voice filled with the trust she had in him. She had no idea that I dreaded those moments, the way he would pull his chair too close, his hand resting on my shoulder for just a little too long. One evening, when my mother was out running errands, Carl and I were alone in the house. I was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to do my homework, when he walked up behind me, his breath warm on the back of my neck. "Rosie, you're such a smart girl," he murmured, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "You know, I could teach you so much more than your teachers ever could." I froze, every instinct screaming at me to get away, but I was too scared to move. His hand slid from my shoulder down to my arm, and I felt a shiver of revulsion run through me. It was then that I finally found my voice. "I need to go to the bathroom," I blurted out, pushing my chair back so fast that it nearly tipped over. I didn't wait for his response. I ran down the hallway and locked myself in the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed in there until I heard my mother's car pull into the driveway. Only then did I emerge, acting as if nothing had happened. I didn't tell her about Carl. I didn't tell anyone. I was too afraid, too ashamed, and I didn't think she would believe me. After all, she seemed so happy with him, so convinced that he was the one who would finally fill the void my father had left. But I couldn't hide my fear forever. Over time, my behavior changed. I became withdrawn, quiet, always finding excuses to avoid being alone with Carl. My mother noticed, of course, but she attributed it to the normal moodiness of a growing child. She never suspected the truth, and I didn't have the courage to tell her. Looking back, I realized that my silence only allowed Carl to stay in our lives longer than he should have. It wasn't until I found the strength to confront my mother, to tell her that I didn't want Carl around anymore, that she finally ended the relationship. But by then, the damage had already been done. The trust between us was shattered, and I had learned the hard way that I couldn't rely on her to protect me. In the years that followed, I kept my distance from my mother's boyfriends. I never let myself get close to any of them, never allowed them to see the real me. I became an expert at putting up walls, at keeping everyone at arm's length. Trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to rebuild, and I wasn't willing to take the risk. But the worst part was the loneliness. Even though I had my mother, even though I was surrounded by people, I felt completely and utterly alone. No one understood what I was going through, and I was too afraid to reach out for help. So I buried my pain deep inside, pretending that it didn't exist, even as it slowly consumed me. Years later, I would look back on that time and wonder how I had managed to survive. But I did, and in the process, I became stronger, more resilient. I learned to rely on myself, to find strength in my own independence. But the ghosts of the past still lingered, haunting my thoughts, reminding me of everything I had lost. Sitting in my apartment now, I could almost feel their presence, hovering just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I would let my guard down. But I wouldn't give them that satisfaction. I had fought too hard to escape their grasp, and I wasn't about to let them pull me back into the darkness. With a sigh, I pushed the memories aside and picked up my phone, scrolling through the contacts until I found the one I was looking for. My grandmother had always been my anchor, the one person I could count on when everything else fell apart. I hadn't spoken to her in a while, and I suddenly felt the need to hear her voice, to remind myself that not everything in my past was tainted by pain. "Hi, Grandma," I said when she answered, my voice trembling slightly. "It's Rosalie." "Rosalie, sweetheart, it's so good to hear from you," she replied, her voice warm and full of love. "How have you been?" "I've been okay," I said, not entirely sure if I was telling the truth. I just needed to talk to someone. "Of course, dear. You can talk to me about anything," she said gently. "Is something bothering you?" I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to share. But this was Grandma. She had always been there for me, and I knew she would understand. "I've been thinking a lot about the past," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "About everything that happened with Mom and Carl." "Oh, Rosalie," she sighed, the sorrow in her voice palpable. "I always wished I could have done more to protect you. I'm so sorry for everything you went through." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, not wanting her to feel guilty. "You did everything you could. I don't know. It's hard to move on sometimes." "I know, sweetheart, but you're strong, stronger than you realize. You've come so far, and I'm so proud of you," she said, her words a balm to my wounded heart. "And remember, you're not alone. I'm here for you always." "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'll never have to find out," she replied softly. "I love you, Rosalie. And no matter what happens, you'll always have a place with me." "I love you too," I said, the words catching in my throat. "I'll come visit soon, I promise." "I'll be waiting," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "Take care of yourself, dear." As I hung up the phone, I felt a little lighter, the weight of the past lifting just enough for me to breathe more easily. The ghosts were still there, but they seemed a little less menacing, their hold on me weakening in the light of my grandmother's love. I knew I still had a long way to go, that the road to healing was a difficult one. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could take the next step, like I wasn't as alone as I had once believed. And that was enough to keep going. The drive to my grandmother's house was always a journey of contrasts. As I left behind the bustling city, with its honking horns and relentless pace, the world around me gradually shifted into a slower, more tranquil rhythm. The concrete jungle gave way to rolling hills and winding country roads, the kind that seemed to carry with them the whispers of forgotten days and simpler times. It was the kind of place where time felt as though it had slowed, where the past mingled effortlessly with the present. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun casting long golden shadows across the front lawn. Grandma's house was a modest, 2-story home nestled among tall oak trees, with a white picket fence that had seen better days. The paint on the shutters was peeling, and the garden was a little overgrown, but to me it was perfect. It was a sanctuary, a place where I had always felt safe. As I stepped out of the car, the familiar creak of the front porch greeted me. I could see Grandma waiting at the door, a warm smile spreading across her face as she waved. There was something so comforting about the way she stood there, a reminder that not everything in my life was broken. "Rosalie, my sweet girl," she called out as I walked up the steps. Her arms opened wide, and I quickly moved into her embrace, feeling the familiar warmth and comfort of her hug. "Hi, Grandma," I murmured into her shoulder, closing my eyes as I soaked in the familiarity of it all. "It's so good to be here." She pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, her hands resting gently on my shoulders. "It's good to have you here. You know this house always feels a little brighter when you're around." I smiled, feeling a little of the tension that had been knotting up inside me start to ease. "I've missed you." "And I've missed you too," she said, her eyes softening with affection. "Come inside. I've got some tea brewing and fresh scones on the table." The scent of baking hit me as soon as I stepped through the door, a blend of cinnamon and butter that made my mouth water. The house was just as I remembered it, filled with the same cozy clutter that had always made it feel like home. Books stacked on shelves, old family photos lining the walls, and the worn, but comfortable, furniture that had been in the family for generations. I followed Grandma into the kitchen, where the kettle was already whistling. She moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of hospitality, pouring the tea into delicate china cups and placing a plate of scones in front of me. "Here you go, dear," she said, sliding the cup toward me. "Tell me, how have you really been?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But this was Grandma. I had never needed to hide anything from her. "It's been hard," I admitted, stirring my tea absently. "I had a long talk with Mom the other day. I told her I wasn't coming back." Grandma nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'm sure that wasn't easy." "It wasn't," I said, taking a small sip of the tea. The warmth of it seeped into me, soothing some of the lingering unease. I just couldn't keep pretending anymore. I spent so much of my life trying to make things right for her, trying to fix the messes she made. But I can't do it anymore, Grandma. I need to live my own life. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. Her skin was soft, the kind of softness that only comes with age and kindness. You've always been so strong, Rosalie, stronger than you realize. It's okay to put yourself first for a change. I looked down at our hands, feeling the sting of tears that I tried to blink away. It just feels like I'm abandoning her. I know she's struggling, but I can't keep sacrificing my happiness for hers. Grandma's thumb brushed gently over the back of my hand. You're not abandoning her. You're setting boundaries. There's a difference, and it's important for both of you. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. I know you're right. It's hard. It is hard, she agreed, her voice gentle but firm. But you're doing the right thing, and you're not alone in this. I'm here for you, and I always will be. I managed a small smile, grateful for her unwavering support. Thank you, Grandma. I don't know what I'd do without you. She gave my hand a squeeze before letting go. You don't have to figure it all out at once, you know. Take your time. You're allowed to heal at your own pace. As we sat there, the silence between us was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that only years of love and trust could bring. Being here with her, in this house that held so many memories, made me feel like I could finally start to piece together the fragments of my life that had been scattered by the storm of my childhood. After we finished our tea, Grandma suggested a walk in the garden, something we had always done together when I was younger. The garden had always been her pride and joy, a place where she found peace among the flowers and herbs that she tended with such care. We strolled along the stone path, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the blooms. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air, and I found myself breathing a little easier with each step. You've kept the garden looking beautiful, Grandma, I said, pausing to admire a cluster of bright red roses. It's my therapy, she replied with a soft laugh. Whenever life gets overwhelming, I come out here and let the plants remind me of the simple things that matter. I nodded, understanding the sentiment. I could use some of that therapy right about now. She smiled at me, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Well, you're welcome to spend as much time here as you like. This garden has seen me through some of my toughest days, and I'm sure it will do the same for you. We continued walking, the sound of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves in the breeze creating a soothing backdrop to our conversation. As we reached the end of the garden, where a bench sat nestled under an old oak tree, Grandma turned to me with a serious expression. Rosalie, she began, her tone gentle but earnest, I want you to know that it's okay to let go of the past. You've carried so much for so long, but you don't have to do that anymore. It's okay to forgive, even if that means forgiving yourself for things that were never your fault. Her words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive Mom, I admitted. There's so much hurt, so much anger. I don't know how to let it go. Grandma nodded, her gaze thoughtful. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened or excusing the pain that was caused. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of that pain. It's a gift you give yourself, not the person who hurt you. I looked down at my hands, the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I don't know how to start. She reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. You start by being kind to yourself, by allowing yourself to feel what you need to feel without judgment. And when you're ready, you'll find that forgiveness isn't as far out of reach as it seems. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The path to forgiveness still felt impossibly long and winding, but being here, in this sanctuary with Grandma, made it seem a little less daunting. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had the strength to take the first step, no matter how small. We sat on the bench for a while, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the garden. Grandma talked about the plants, the changes in the seasons, and the simple joys of life that I had long since forgotten in the chaos of my own. It was the kind of conversation that soothed the soul, reminding me that there was more to life than the pain I had carried for so long. As the evening settled in and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in years. This place, this sanctuary with Grandma, was where I belonged, where I could start to heal. And as I looked up at the stars, I silently made a promise to myself. I would find a way to forgive, not just for my mother's sake, but for my own. Because I deserved to be free from the ghosts of the past, to finally live a life unburdened by the pain that had haunted me for so long. With that thought, I leaned my head on Grandma's shoulder, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath, and let the calm of the night wash over me. I was safe here, and for now, that was enough. The air was heavy with tension as I stood outside my mother's front door, my heart pounding in my chest. The drive from Grandma's had been filled with mixed emotions: anger, fear, and a deep sense of dread. I hadn't planned on seeing her again so soon, but life has a way of forcing us into confrontations we're not ready for. The call had come just a few hours ago. One of the twins had fallen ill, and my mother was desperate for help. Despite everything, the plea in her voice had tugged at something inside me, a remnant of the bond we once had. I sighed deeply, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to escape back to the sanctuary I had found with Grandma. But another part of me knew that I couldn't keep running forever. This was my life, complicated and messy as it was, and I had to face it head-on, no matter how much it hurt. Finally, I gathered the courage to knock. A moment later, the door swung open, and there she was, my mother, looking more worn and frazzled than I remembered. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw me. A flicker of something, relief, maybe, crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "Rosalie," she breathed, her voice a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "You came." I nodded, my throat tight. I came. She stepped aside to let me in, the familiar scent of the house enveloping me as I crossed the threshold. It was the same house I had grown up in, but everything felt different now, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of all the unspoken words and unresolved pain between us. As we moved into the living room, I could hear the muffled sounds of the twins playing in the next room, their laughter a stark contrast to the heavy silence that had settled between my mother and me. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked, her voice strained as she tried to fill the awkward silence. "No, I'm fine," I replied, my tone flat. She nodded, wringing her hands nervously. I'm sorry for calling you like this. I know I said I wouldn't, but..." "It's okay," I cut her off, not wanting to hear her apologies. "What's going on with the twins?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty before she spoke. "Liam's been running a high fever since last night. I've tried everything, but it's not coming down." I didn't know who else to call. I sighed, rubbing my temples as I processed her words. "Have you taken him to the doctor?" She shook her head, her expression guilty. "No, I thought maybe it was just a bug, that it would pass. But now I'm scared, Rosalie. I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked slightly, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had driven so many of her decisions in the past. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push down the surge of frustration that was bubbling up inside me. I knew this pattern all too well. My mother, overwhelmed and desperate, turning to me to fix things, to make it all better. It was a role I had played for far too long, and I wasn't sure I could do it again. But there was also a part of me that couldn't ignore the fact that Liam was just a child, an innocent caught in the crossfire of our complicated relationship. And for his sake, I knew I had to step up, at least for now. "Let me see him," I said, my voice softening slightly. She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face as she led me down the hallway to the twins' room. The sight of Liam, pale and lethargic on the bed, tugged at my heart. He was so small, so vulnerable, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for ever considering leaving him to suffer. I knelt by his bedside, gently placing my hand on his forehead. His skin was burning hot to the touch, and his breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. I could see the worry etched in his eyes as he looked up at me, and I forced a reassuring smile. "Hey, Liam," I said softly, brushing a strand of damp hair off his forehead. "How are you feeling, buddy?" He shook his head weakly, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't feel good, Rosie," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I know," I murmured, squeezing his hand gently. "But we're going to make you feel better, okay? I promise." I turned to my mother, who was hovering anxiously in the doorway. "We need to get him to the hospital," I said firmly. "He's dehydrated, and his fever is too high. He needs proper care." She nodded, her face pale with worry. "I'll get the car keys." As she hurried out of the room, I stayed by Liam's side, doing my best to comfort him. My mind was racing, a mix of medical training and personal memories colliding in a chaotic swirl. It was a bitter reminder of the past, of all the times I had stepped in to fix things when my mother couldn't. But as much as I resented her for it, I couldn't turn my back on Liam. He deserved better than to be caught in the middle of our strained relationship. A few minutes later, my mother returned with the keys, and I carefully lifted Liam into my arms. He clung to me, his small body trembling with fever, and I felt a surge of protectiveness that I hadn't expected. As we made our way to the car, my mother's eyes met mine, a silent plea for understanding in her gaze. But I couldn't give her that, not yet. There was too much history, too much hurt between us. For now, all I could do was focus on getting Liam the help he needed. The drive to the hospital was tense, the silence in the car punctuated only by Liam's laboured breathing. My mother kept glancing at me, as if searching for something, reassurance, forgiveness, maybe even a sign that things between us could be different. But I couldn't give her that, not when my heart was still so heavy with unresolved pain. When we finally arrived at the hospital, I handed Liam over to the medical team, my mind shifting into professional mode as I explained his symptoms and history. My mother hovered nearby, her hands trembling as she watched the doctor's work. I could see the fear in her eyes, the desperation that had driven her to call me in the first place. Once Liam was stabilized and admitted for observation, we were left alone in the waiting room. The tension between us was palpable, the silence heavy with all the things we weren't saying. I could feel her eyes on me, but I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, my thoughts swirling in a chaotic mess. "Rosalie," she began hesitantly, breaking the silence. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I looked up at her, my heart aching with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I've heard that before, Mom. So many times." "I know," she said, her voice trembling. "And I know I've failed you in so many ways. But I'm trying, Rosalie. I'm trying to be better." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words pressed down on me. "It's not that simple, Mom. You can't just say sorry. and expect everything to be okay. I know, she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. But I don't know what else to do. I need you, Rosalie. I need your help. Her words cut deep, reopening old wounds that I had tried so hard to close. You always need my help, don't you? But what about what I need, Mum? Have you ever thought about that? She looked down, her tears spilling over as she shook her head. I'm so sorry, Rosalie. I didn't mean for it to be this way. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke through, and I stood up, my voice shaking with emotion. But it is this way, Mum. It's always been this way. I spent my whole life cleaning up after your messes, trying to fix things that I didn't break. And I'm tired, Mum. I'm so tired. She flinched at my words, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of my anger was too much for her to bear. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I didn't know how to do it on my own. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the storm of emotions that was raging inside me. Maybe it's time you learned, I said softly, the anger in my voice replaced by a deep, aching sadness. Because I can't keep doing this, Mom. I can't keep sacrificing myself to save you. She didn't respond, her tears falling silently as she stared at the floor. The weight of my words hung between us, a bitter reminder of the chasm that had grown between us over the years. For a long moment, we just stood there, two broken people trying to find a way to navigate the wreckage of our relationship. But in that moment, I realized that it wasn't my job to fix her, to mend the broken pieces of her life. I had my own life to live, my own wounds to heal. I'm going to go check on Liam, I said quietly, turning to leave the room. As I walked away, I could feel her gaze on my back, a silent plea for forgiveness that I wasn't ready to give. Not yet. But maybe, one day, we could find a way to rebuild what had been broken. Maybe, one day, we could find a way to heal. But for now, all I could do was focus on what was in front of me, the people who needed me, the life I was trying to build for myself, and that would have to be enough. The weeks following Liam's hospitalization were a blur of emotions and realizations. The time spent between the hospital and Grandma's house had given me plenty of time to think, to reflect on what I wanted from my life, and to reconsider the boundaries I had always struggled to establish with my mother. The experience with Liam had been a harsh reminder of the tangled web of dependence and guilt that had always defined our relationship. I knew it was time to finally break free, to truly embrace the independence I had fought so hard to claim. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself back at Grandma's house, sitting in the sunroom with a cup of tea in hand. The soft light filtered through the lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the floor. Grandma sat across from me, knitting quietly, the rhythmic click of her needles the only sound between us. It was a peaceful moment, one that I cherished deeply. Being here, in this sanctuary, had always given me a sense of calm that I couldn't find anywhere else. But as much as I loved being here, I knew that I couldn't stay forever. I had to find my own place in the world, to build a life that was entirely my own. Rosalie, Grandma's gentle voice broke through my thoughts, drawing my attention. You've been awfully quiet lately. What's on your mind, dear? I looked up at her, feeling a wave of gratitude for the way she always knew when something was weighing on me. I've been thinking a lot about the future, I admitted, my voice soft, about what I want for myself. Grandma paused her knitting, her wise eyes studying me carefully. And what is it that you want, my dear? I took a deep breath, letting the words settle in my mind before I spoke them aloud. I want to live my own life, Grandma. I don't want to be stuck in the same cycle with Mom, always cleaning up after her messes and putting my own needs last. I need to break free from that, to finally be independent. A small, approving smile tugged at the corners of Grandma's lips. You've always been strong, Rosalie. Stronger than you give yourself credit for. And I think it's wise of you to recognize what you need to do for yourself. I nodded, feeling a sense of resolve build within me. But it's not easy. I still care about Mom, and I don't want to abandon her. But I can't keep sacrificing my own happiness for her sake. Grandma set down her knitting, reaching across the table to place her hand over mine. You're not abandoning her, Rosalie. You're setting boundaries. There's a big difference. Your mother has to learn to stand on her own 2 feet, just like you have. It's not your job to carry her burdens. I squeezed her hand, feeling the warmth of her support. You're right. I know you're right. But it's still hard. Of course it is, she said softly. But you've already taken the first step by recognizing what you need. The next step is to take action. Have you thought about where you want to go, what you want to do? I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I've been thinking about finding a place of my own. I want to stay in town, close to you and the twins. But I need my own space, somewhere I can truly call home. Grandma's smile widened, and she gave my hand an encouraging squeeze. I think that's a wonderful idea, Rosalie. You deserve a place that's just yours, where you can create the life you want. The thought of having my own space, of decorating it just the way I liked, and filling it with things that made me happy, filled me with a sense of excitement and anticipation. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something new, something entirely my own. A few days later, I found myself back at my mother's house, ready to have the conversation I had been dreading. The twins were at school, and the house was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. My mother sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. I've been thinking a lot about what happened with Liam, I began, my voice steady but firm, and about our relationship. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. I've been thinking about it too, Rosalie. I know things have been difficult between us. Difficult is an understatement, I said, a hint of sadness in my voice. But I'm not here to rehash old arguments. I'm here to tell you that I'm moving out. I'm going to find a place of my own, and I'm going to start living my life on my own terms. Her eyes widened slightly, and I could see the panic rising in them. But Rosalie, what about the twins? What about me? I'm not abandoning you, Mom, I said firmly, repeating Grandma's words. I'm setting boundaries. You need to start taking responsibility for your own life, for the choices you've made. I can't keep being the one to fix everything. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. But I knew that this was necessary for both of us. She needed to learn to stand on her own, just as I had. I understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want to lose you, Rosalie. I know I've made mistakes. So many mistakes. But I need you. I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. You don't need me, Mom. You need to find your own strength, to figure out how to live without relying on me to pick up the pieces. I'll still be here for you, but on my own terms. She nodded slowly, the tears spilling over as she wiped them away with the back of her hand. I'll try, Rosalie. I'll try to do better. That's all I can ask, I said softly, feeling a sense of closure begin to settle over me. As I left her house that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. The decision to move out, to create a life that was entirely my own, had been a long time coming. And while I knew there would still be challenges ahead, I was ready to face them with the strength and independence I had fought so hard to claim. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of apartment hunting, packing, and making plans for my new life. With Grandma's help, I found a small, cozy apartment in town, just a short drive from her house. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and that was all that mattered. On the day I moved in, I stood in the empty living room, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was my space, my sanctuary, and I could already envision the life I would build here, a life of my own choosing. As I unpacked the last of my boxes, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Grandma standing there, holding a potted plant in her hands, a wide smile on her face. "I thought you could use a little greenery in your new place," she said, handing me the plant. I smiled, taking the plant from her and setting it on the windowsill. "It's perfect. Thank you, Grandma." She stepped inside, looking around at the sparsely furnished apartment. It may be empty now, but I could already see it becoming a warm, inviting home, just like you, Rosalie. I felt a swell of gratitude and love for the woman who had always been my anchor, my guide. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you, Grandma. Thank you for everything." She smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. "You did this on your own, Rosalie. You found your own way, and I'm so proud of you." As we stood there together, looking out at the sunlit room, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. This was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where I would finally embrace my independence and live life on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.